Dude, with all the hype around Resident Evil 9 being so high, it's time to face the truth. Which is the worst and which is the best Resident Evil ever made? In this video, I'm ranking only the mainline games, including remakes, from worst to best. Spin-offs, extra games, and side experiences are left out. That's material for another video. The order here takes into account what the gaming community thinks, review scores, technical aspects, and above all, the real experience of those who actually played. And I'll warn you right now, you'll probably disagree with at least one position, and that's exactly why this video exists.
Again, the gate's locked. Anything you can do?
Resident Evil 6. There's no other way to start this list. Resident Evil 6 is the moment when the franchise suffered a complete identity collapse. Capcom tried to embrace everyone at the same time. Those who wanted horror with Leon, those who wanted military action with Chris, and those who wanted, well, whatever Jake's campaign was supposed to be. The result is a bloated, confusing game that feels more like a Michael Bay movie than a Resident Evil. The excessive use of QuickTime events is irritating and completely takes control away from the player in moments that should be tense. The combat does have some interesting ideas, like the dodge and slide system, but the levels are so linear and the situations so absurd that you lose any sense of danger. You don't feel like you're in a survival horror game. You feel like you're in a generic shooter with a zombie skin. It's a game that ignores resource management, the soul of the series, in exchange for constant explosions and a global plot that borders on ridiculous. It sits here at rock bottom because it tried to be everything and ended up being nothing, leaving a bitter taste for those who expected the weight and atmosphere that defined the brand. Resident Evil 5. Unlike its immediate predecessor, Resident Evil 5 at least knew what it wanted to be, a cooperative action game. The problem is that, in doing so, it threw almost all the remaining mystery of the franchise out the window. Playing under the scorching African sun removes any trace of a dark atmosphere, and Sheva's artificial intelligence, if you're playing solo, is a constant test of patience. She wastes ammo and herbs at the worst possible moments. The game is fun if you have a friend on the couch, but as a Resident Evil title, it is extremely shallow. The scale of the boss battles was impressive for its time, but everything feels too choreographed, without that fear of what might be waiting in the next room. The final fight inside a volcano, with Chris punching a giant boulder, became the symbol of how the series had lost touch with reality. It works as an action shooter, but fails miserably at delivering the tension of running low on ammo in a dark hallway. It's a technically competent title for its generation, but one that lacks the soul and pacing that make a Resident Evil unforgettable. Resident Evil 0 is a game that divides opinions, but in the end, it weighs more because of its design mistakes than its successes. The idea of controlling two characters at the same time, Billy and Rebecca, is interesting on paper, but in practice, it turns into an extremely exhausting inventory management system. Removing the classic item boxes and forcing the player to drop items on the ground, and then having to cross the entire map just to retrieve a hook or a crank, is one of the most frustrating decisions in the history of the series. Visually, the game is beautiful, with pre-rendered backgrounds that are still impressive today because of their level of detail, and the opening on the train is one of the most atmospheric moments in the franchise. However, as you move into the training facility, the enemies become generic, such as monkeys and giant insects, losing the impact of the classic monsters. It's a game that demands a level of patience that not every survival horror fan has, and one that often feels like it's punishing you in a bureaucratic way rather than challenging you through fear. It's an important chapter for the lore, but it fails to maintain a smooth flow of fun due to its questionable mechanical choices. Resident Evil 3 Remake. This one hurts because the potential was enormous. The remake of the third game had the thankless task of following the massive success of the Resident Evil 2 remake, but what we got was a product that feels rushed and incomplete. Jill is excellent, and the combat is refined, with the dodge mechanic bringing a new dynamic, but the real crime here was the content cuts. Removing iconic areas like the Clock Tower and Raccoon City Park is something the community has never forgiven. On top of that, Nemesis, who should have been the game's greatest threat, was turned into a series of scripted sequences. In the original, the fear came from not knowing when he would show up. Here, he appears at predetermined moments and quickly turns into a quadruped creature that loses all of its intimidation. The game lasts around 5 or 6 hours on a first playthrough, which is far too short for a full-priced title. It's a visually impeccable experience and very fun to play, but it leaves a lingering "I want more" feeling that is never satisfied. It sits in this position because despite being technically superior to earlier entries, it fails to respect the grandeur of the original material. Resident Evil Village is a roller coaster of sensations that tries, and often succeeds, to be a celebration of everything the franchise has ever been. It takes the first-person perspective from the 7th game and drops it into a structure that strongly resembles the pacing of Resident Evil 4. What makes this game worth your time is the absurd variety of settings and tones. One moment you're in a gothic castle facing giant vampires, and the next you're trapped in a silent house, experiencing one of the most terrifying and psychological moments in Capcom's recent history. Resource management returns to a central role, and the introduction of the Duke as a merchant brings back that sense of constant progression we all love. Visually, the game is a technical marvel. The village feels like a real place, cold and hopeless. However, it loses a few points in its final stretch, which leans too heavily into over-the-top action and ends up diluting the tension that was so carefully built in the early hours. Ethan Winters finally gains a stronger personality, and the way the game ties up loose ends in the Umbrella lore is fascinating. It's a title that embraces the more fantastical and absurd side of the series, but does so with so much polish and creativity that it's impossible not to get swept up in the journey. Resident Evil Code Veronica. For many purists, this is the true Resident Evil 3. Originally released for the Dreamcast, it was the first mainline entry to abandon pre-rendered backgrounds in favor of fully polygonal environments, and that completely changed how the camera moved and how tension was applied. The story is one of the most dramatic and soap opera-like in the franchise, focusing on siblings Claire and Chris Redfield against the bizarre Ashford family. The difficulty level here is notorious. It's a game that isn't afraid to leave you in a dead end if you don't manage your ammo perfectly. The character switching system and the setting on Rockfort Island create a suffocating atmosphere of isolation. The biggest issue that keeps it from the top is its excessive backtracking design, and a few moments that border on being unfair to the player, such as the infamous airplane confrontation or the possibility of losing crucial items if you don't know what's coming next. Even so, it's a classic that breathes the identity of classic survival horror and features some of the smartest puzzles in the series. It deserves respect for the courage to evolve technically at the time, and for delivering one of the most disturbing villains in the entire saga. Resident Evil Remake. Many consider this the best remake ever made in the history of the industry, and it's easy to see why. It takes the original 1996 game and transforms it into a masterpiece of atmospheric horror. The pre-rendered backgrounds here reached a level of perfection that, even decades later, still feels scarier and more detailed than much modern 3D scenery. The introduction of the Crimson Heads, zombies that come back to life faster and more lethal if you don't burn the bodies, was a masterstroke that added a layer of strategy and fear the original didn't have. Entering the Spencer Mansion here isn't just an exercise in nostalgia, it's a sensory experience of pure discomfort. Every creaking door and every shadow cast by the masterful lighting contributes to a constant sense of dread.
The pacing is slow, focused on exploration and puzzle solving that requires you to truly pay attention to the environment. It respects Shinji Mikami's work while expanding the lore with the tragic story of Lisa Trevor, adding an emotional depth the franchise rarely achieved at the time. It's survival horror in its purest, most distilled and elegant form. A game that proves horror doesn't need cheap jump scares when it has impeccable art direction. Resident Evil 4. It's impossible to overstate the impact this game had, not only on the series, but on the entire action game industry. Resident Evil 4 shifted the camera to an over-the-shoulder perspective, and in doing so, redefined how we interact with danger. Leon S. Kennedy goes from being the rookie of Raccoon City to an unstoppable agent in a rural Spain that feels straight out of a nightmare. The gameplay flow here is flawless. The game knows exactly when to ramp things up with hordes of ganados and when to slow down and keep you on edge in a dark corridor. The Tetris-style inventory system and the presence of the iconic merchant created an addictive gameplay loop that many tried to copy, but none surpassed. Although it pushed the series away from traditional horror and leaned more heavily into action, the macabre village atmosphere and the colossal boss battles ensure that the franchise's DNA is still there. It's a game that refuses to become monotonous, constantly introducing new mechanics and enemies with each chapter. If we have so many successful shooters today, it's because Resident Evil 4 opened the doors and showed how to deliver visceral, rewarding combat. It doesn't sit at the absolute top, only because what came after managed to refine this formula even further or bring back the horror more intensely, but its historical importance is undeniable. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. After the identity disaster of the 6th game, no one knew if the franchise could be saved, and that's when Capcom slammed its fist on the table and delivered Resident Evil 7. Switching to a first-person perspective was a bold decision that saved the series, bringing horror to a level of intimacy we had never felt before. The setting inside the Baker family's house in Louisiana is suffocating. You can almost smell the rotten food and feel the dampness of the walls through the screen. The game revived the concept of being hunted by something you can't simply kill with 3 shots, and the introduction of Jack Baker as a relentless pursuer in the early hours is a masterclass in tension design. Resource management came back in full force, and every handgun bullet you found felt like a treasure. Although the final stretch on the ship and in the mines loses some of its shine by focusing too heavily on combat against generic enemies, the cultural impact of RE7 is massive. It proved that Resident Evil could still be terrifying and modern at the same time, using the RE engine to deliver photorealism that, combined with macabre sound design, makes this one of the most immersive and visceral chapters in the entire saga.
When you need only accept the sacred gift.
Resident Evil 4 Remake. Many thought it was impossible to improve what was already considered perfect, but Capcom proved otherwise. The remake of Resident Evil 4 is not just a graphical upgrade, it's a reimagining that understands exactly where the original needed more weight and where it could be darker. Combat was refined with the knife parry mechanic, adding an absurd layer of strategy. Now you don't just shoot, you manage your equipment's durability while deciding whether to spend ammo or risk a counterattack. The game's tone is much denser, leaning more toward horror than the original, without losing that over-the-top fun of early 2000s action movies. The sections with Ashley were completely reworked so she feels like a useful companion rather than a burden, and Leon's development as a traumatized character adds a new depth to the story. The pacing is relentless, and every area, from the village to the island, was expanded with new challenges and secrets. It's a game that respects the source material in an almost religious way, but has the courage to cut what was silly and add what was necessary to make it the definitive modern action survival experience.
Yes, the time. What is it?
Resident Evil 1996. It's impossible not to place the game that started it all in a position of prominence. It may feel dated to those who started playing more recently, but in 1996, this title was a cultural shock. It didn't create survival horror, but it was the game that defined the rules we still follow today. Limited inventory, fixed cameras that hide danger around the next corner, puzzles that demand meticulous exploration, and of course, the constant feeling of vulnerability. The Spencer Mansion is perhaps the most iconic setting in gaming history, a labyrinth full of traps and secrets that you must learn to navigate as if it were your own home. The live-action opening and the cheesy voice acting are charming today, but the terror of seeing the first zombie slowly turn its head, or the jump scare of the dogs crashing through the window, are moments that became etched into the DNA of every veteran gamer. It taught us that fear doesn't come only from the monster, but from the uncertainty of whether you have enough resources to reach the next safe room. Without this game, nothing we've discussed here would exist. It is the stone foundation upon which an empire was built, and its design structure is still studied by anyone who wants to understand what makes a horror game truly work.
Resident Evil 2, 1998. If the first game proved that the formula worked, Resident Evil 2 proved that it could be expanded to an epic scale. Leaving the isolated mansion and being thrown into the chaos of Raccoon City was a massive leap in ambition. The Scenario A and Scenario B system, where the actions you took with Leon affected Claire's campaign and vice versa, was revolutionary for its time, and gave the game a replay value that few titles had. The police station, the RPD, is one of the most brilliant map designs in gaming history, turning a public building into a nightmarish labyrinth. The monsters became more varied and more terrifying, with the introduction of the Licker and Mr. X, who even back then brought a sense of relentless pursuit that left anyone on edge. The game perfectly balances survival horror with a biological conspiracy narrative that expanded the Umbrella universe in a masterful way. It is the peak of the series' classic era, a title that took everything the original did and pushed it to the maximum, delivering an urban apocalypse atmosphere that even today, with 32-bit graphics, still manages to convey a sense of urgency and desperation that few modern remakes can replicate with the same soul. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Many people may be surprised to see the 1999 classic ranked this high, but anyone who lived through the PS1 era knows there was nothing more terrifying than the sound of stars echoing through an empty corridor. Resident Evil 3 took the structure of Resident Evil 2 and injected it with a massive dose of adrenaline and panic. Nemesis wasn't a common enemy. He was a force of nature that broke the game's rules, bursting through doors and chasing you across different areas, something no one was prepared to deal with at the time. The real-time choice system and ammo crafting added a layer of strategy that brought an incredible sense of freshness to the formula. Raccoon City felt huge, a city in flames that worked like a maze, where every corner hid a new danger. Jill Valentine truly cemented herself here as one of the industry's greatest protagonists, resilient and capable of facing a threat that seemed invincible. The constant sense of urgency, the farewell atmosphere of a dying city, and the uncertainty of when that giant monster would crash through a window make this game an unmatched experience. It's the perfect balance between classic survival horror and tense action, a title that, despite its technical limitations, still delivers more psychological dread than many modern games with cutting-edge graphics. Resident Evil 2 Remake. This game is the gold standard. It's the example I use when I want to explain how to modernize a classic without losing a single millimeter of its essence. Capcom didn't just remake Resident Evil 2, it distilled everything the franchise does best and delivered an impeccable product. Inventory management is tense, the sound design is on another level, and the way the environment reacts to your shots, with zombies losing chunks of their bodies in a visceral way, is still impressive today. But the true masterstroke here is Mr. X. The way he was re-implemented as a constant threat whose footsteps you hear echoing through the police station turns the RPD into a place of pure desperation. You have to plan your routes, decide which enemies are worth the ammo and when it's better to simply run. The game respects the player's time. There's no filler, no padding. It's a masterclass in pacing and atmosphere. It brought back the feeling that a single zombie in a narrow hallway can be more dangerous than an entire army. It's a technically flawless, visually terrifying, and mechanically brilliant title. Proof that survival horror is still king when it's made by those who understand that fear comes from limitation and the unknown. Ranking Resident Evil is always a minefield. Everyone has that one game they played in their childhood that, to them, is the greatest of all time. But when you look at things objectively, at world building, the evolution of mechanics, and the impact each entry had, this is the journey of a franchise that refuses to die, constantly reinventing itself, sometimes failing badly, but then hitting the mark in a masterful way shortly after. The future with Resident Evil 9 looks bright precisely because Capcom learned from past missteps and understood that fans want to feel fear, want to manage herbs and ammunition, and above all, want to be challenged by a hostile world. Now, it's your turn to jump into the discussion. You definitely have a different order in your head or think I was unfair to some title, so drop it in the comments. What's your top 3 of the franchise, and which game do you think deserves more recognition than it gets?